Wetlands also make a pretty big difference when it comes to holding water during times of drought and flooding. Now, we know the provincial auditor has been critical of unapproved ditches, the ones that farmers sometimes dig to get more cropland out of a given field. Well, this fall, Saskatchewan's Water Security Agency is writing a new policy. It's calling it the Agricultural Water Stewardship Policy. Will it go far enough? Well, I think we can all agree that clean water, healthy wetlands, they're crucial in our environment. But how best can we protect the wetlands we have in Saskatchewan? Our Provincial Water Security Agency is in the middle of a series of consultations with people from across the province. The agency is tasked with creating what it's calling a new Agricultural Water Stewardship Policy. Well, some conservationists and some Indigenous groups say this process is skewed toward expanding farmland, and they say wetlands should maybe have their own conservation policy. Well, coming up in this half hour, we will hear from a woman who delivered more than 2,000 letters to the provincial government this morning. Letters raising concerns about water quality and the way we're managing wetlands. We will hear from Saskatchewan's Water Security Agency later in the show with one of the women tasked with running all these consultations. And our first guest today, one of the foremost experts in Saskatchewan when it comes to wetlands and water policy. Dr. Peter Levitt is a professor of biology at the University of Regina. He's a Canada Research Chair in Environmental Change and Society, and he joins us now on Blue Sky. Hello there, Peter. How are you?
Hi, Jennifer. I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm all right. And I'm wondering if you can sort of give us the thumbnail sketch for our listeners. How do we currently manage wetlands in Saskatchewan?
We don't really. I mean, in 1995, the provincial government introduced a wetlands conservation policy, and I want to emphasize the word conservation there. And this was introduced by a number of agencies: the Saskatchewan Wetland Conservation Corporation, a crown corporation to conserve wetlands, SaskAg, Sask Environment Resource Management, the municipal governments, and Sask Water, who were tasked at the time with controlling water flow. It wasn't well received. Basically, eventually, Sask Wetland Conservation Corporation was discontinued, and the province has been flailing a little bit since then in terms of their wetlands policy. The latest iteration of that is a good restart in the sense that we're trying to get back to something like a policy, but it's got some issues associated with it.
What are some of those issues?
Well, there's a number. There's the general idea of embedding wetlands policy within an explicitly agricultural framework. I think it was mentioned earlier that excuse me. It was mentioned earlier that there's a concern that this is going to be pivoting too much towards agricultural production. And certainly a lot of the discussions that I've heard, it's mostly about how do we have a strong, vibrant economy. And I don't think anybody's opposed to that, but it's at what cost? And I think there's very little accounting for cost. And most of it, well, I'll give you an example. The last interview that I had with Water Security Agency, the final question was, what proportion of wetlands do you think we can safely drain? There was no discussion about reestablishing wetlands. There was no meaningful consultation with Indigenous peoples. There was no meaningful conservation. It was really, look, we can get more if we have more land for farming, so how much do you think we can get rid of? And this completely ignores what I think is the second point, is that we've already drained somewhere between 50 and 70% of all wetlands in Saskatchewan, southern Saskatchewan anyway. This has been going on really since colonial agriculture started, and it comes and goes, it accelerates and decelerates, but the fact is it's an ongoing process. So the problem is this sort of framework is only forward-looking. It's just saying, how can we make things not worse than they are at present, instead of how can we make things better than they are? And so there's really no consideration about what sort of damages have occurred, where have the wetlands been drained in the past, what were the consequences of that. And as somebody who works on water quality in the province and has done so for over 30 years, I can tell you, and most people will agree, the water quality is generally fairly dreadful. Now, it's naturally green here. That's just because it's a fertile place. It's good for growing grain, so it's good for growing little round green things in lakes, but it's greener than it should be.
Ah,
And when we've been surveying lakes, we survey about 100 lakes in southern Saskatchewan every decade or so, and then we have a whole series of lakes that we sample every year. What we see is that about 40% of the lakes have, toxin levels above World Health Organization or Canada Environment advisories. So now they're not necessarily directly toxic to people, but the point is we've got a lot of problems, and we don't have any really good way of linking up the loss of the wetlands with the degradation of water quality, other than it occurs pretty much everywhere that wetlands are drained. So what wetlands do is they can be sources of water to the groundwater that people need for rural wells. They can be important for irrigation. They can be recharge areas for streams. That is, the water in the ground bubbles out, and you get the sort of the headwater of the Qu'Appelle River, for example, is in a wetlands complex about halfway between Buffalo Pound and Diefenbaker to the west. That's called Eyebrow Lake, but it's really just a wetland.
okay.
So, there's this basic issue that we don't have enough water to grow trees, and we're talking about how to have less water on the prairies. At the same time, we're also having a discussion about, well, we need irrigation to guarantee that we don't get hit by droughts. And I think Ethan made a very good point that there's a link between the amount of water on the landscape and how much water comes down in precipitation.
Is it true there is that old farm saying that water draws water? How true is that?
Absolutely. It's absolutely true. Ask pretty much any farmer. They can get through 1 year drought, but it's the multiple year droughts that are the real problem. So we did a project with Sask Crop Insurance Corporation almost as soon as I got to the province, where we tried to look at how often droughts occur. And droughts as bad as the 1930s are like a 1 in 60 year event, and we're actually kind of overdue for one. Mm-hmm. And what happens is you have moist soils in the spring that allows germination of the seeds, but it also allows evaporation. So what are called convective storms, the evaporation of water into the atmosphere, and then you get the big thunderhead and the rain comes down and that fuels the crop growth later in the summer. That's dependent on having at least moist soils. Taking the wetlands off the landscape, draining them unnecessarily. Now, there's some necessary drainage, but unnecessary drainage is going to affect that climate system. So whether it happens in a measurable timeline, like in the next couple of years, or it just happens over decades, it doesn't matter. It should happen.
It's the same net effect.
Yep.
Where is drainage necessary?
Well, so you've hit on an interesting point, and that's my third issue with the policy as presented, is that there's not a very good distinction between the wetlands, permanent water bodies, and wet land. And so the province likes to roll out a statistic that 86% of wetland area is not drained, but they include in that statistic farmland, which is actually put into production, but which is wet in the spring.
Oh, low spots.
Yeah. And so where do we need drainage? Well, we want to have the land put into production at a reasonable pace, but we also need to balance that with over enthusiastic spring drainage, which tends to flood downstream areas. So where we need it is where we have low-lying land, but also bearing in mind that it has an effect on the climate system. And if you didn't plow those areas, they would be shallow wetlands. They might be recharge points for the groundwater.
But you're plowing them every year.
But you're plowing them every year. But that that's fine. I think we have some wetlands now. The problem is the go forward position is how many fewer can we have in the future?
What proportion can we safely drain without messing things up?
Yeah.
And what was your answer to that?
Negative. Both myself and my colleague, Dr. Kerry Finley, both said it's wrong-headed. You're starting from the position that we can get rid of wetlands. And I think most wetlands ecologists or most waterfowl people or most people that are concerned with biodiversity would say exactly the opposite. You've drained so much that you're starting to affect things like migratory waterfowl, hence waterfowl. They need it for nesting, they need it for feeding, they need it for migratory routes. And we're on a central continental flyway, so things like whooping cranes come straight up through the pipe, right through the middle of Saskatchewan. They need water bodies on their route. So yes, the big lakes help for some instances, but the smaller water bodies that typically are fringed with native vegetation, they're really important. The other thing which we haven't talked about is wetlands are really important as a biofilter to remove. We have some unnecessary or some consequent effects of having such a large area in agriculture. We're going to have pesticides. We're going to have fertilizers.
Right.
We don't want those to distribute off of the land because that's where they're having a positive effect. When they get in the water flows downhill. Those
It
chemicals
gets pretty gross.
Well, those chemicals end up in places that they shouldn't be, and you get abnormally green water, you get toxic algae, you get loss of oxygen, which is a problem in the lakes in the province. It's actually a problem globally. And when that starts to happen, you start to have fisheries issues.
Okay. Peter, I've got to let you know, we've got people lined up waiting to talk to you. I'd like to take a question from Fran, who's on the line in Regina. Go ahead, Fran. Welcome to Blue Sky.
Hi, thank you very much. My concern, long and short, is about Lake Diefenbaker. It is dropping more all the time, and due to less snowpack on the glaciers every year with global warming, incoming water from the mountains to Lake Diefenbaker is declining, and less water is reaching Lake Diefenbaker. More incoming water is being held in Alberta reservoirs. They're building more for irrigation in Alberta from snowmelt before it's needed for crops. Then there's water from Lake Diefenbaker going to potash mines, hydropower, tourism, parks and rec at Lake Diefenbaker, and the huge $4 billion irrigation project. And now SaskPower is looking to require water from Lake Diefenbaker for a small modular nuclear reactor. And all of this doesn't even take into account the effects on the flora and fauna. So who's looking out for that?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, the Water Security Agency is tasked with protection of water quality in the province. They're also, along with SaskWater, tasked with sort of controlling the flow. I think the province does a pretty good job in controlling where water is and where it goes, and it's quite weak when it comes to the quality of the water if it's not in excess or too little. So your question about the Diefenbaker project's an interesting one. The project's on hold at the moment. It's been suggested by provincial sources that it's an economic reason. I think the bigger reason is that we're waiting for the Supreme Court of Canada to weigh in on the Impacts Assessment Act. And if it's reversed, as Alberta and Saskatchewan would like, then there may not be the need for a impacts assessment. If it's not reversed, at least part of that project has to undergo federal evaluation. So I think everything's on hold right now. So the upshot of your answer is both the province and the federal government have the responsibility to do what's called a cumulative impacts assessment. The province doesn't really want to do it, so we'll see what happens.
Fran, thank you so much.
Is that in regards to the nuclear reactor, or is that in regards to the irrigation project, or everything?
Everything is the short answer. Basically, cumulative just means all the things that are affecting the water. And that's kind of the big problem that we've got is we tend to take a piecemeal approach to doing things like, okay, this potash mine's fine. It's going to generate $4 billion. This is all good. But then we forget that there's another 5 or 6 lined up after that, plus there's industrial extraction, plus there's regulation, pollution from cities and farms, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Fran. We do have Aurelie McPherson who is standing by, and this morning she went to the provincial legislature and brought 2,251 letters with her, letters from people living across Saskatchewan. Now, Aurelie McPherson's with the Saskatchewan Alliance for Water Sustainability, and she joins us. Aurelie, welcome to Blue Sky, and tell us what prompted all these letters.
Oh, thank you so much, Jennifer. In 2022, we reached out. We learned that there was an engagement about a new policy that was happening for managing water. And we asked if we could be part of that process, and we were told no. And so we became very concerned. And they offered, Water Security said you can go to a website. But we knew that our community would be, it's intimidating to take that process. And so we said, hey, let's make sure that our community knows what's going on. And we went to parades, festivals, and powwows. And we had gracious friends who said, hey, I'll take 10 letters, or I'll take 50 letters, or I'll take 100 letters. It was just overwhelming. It was just sort of a grassroots. Let's have our say, and let's see. And we hope that the Premier will respect the words that we've put before him.
So I know we actually have a caller who's on the line hoping to talk with you. Sandy in Kelvington is on the line. Sandy, I know you've been standing by for a bit. what was your question when it comes to wetlands and preserving waterways?
Well, it's great that you got Orly on the program today. And Orly, there's a number of us that wanted to phone in and talk to you, and we decided that I would be the one. So it might be a little long-winded, but please bear with me. As someone who has farmed for the past 40 years, this wetland policy crisis is an extenuation of the worship-like status that politicians have for farmers in this province, to the extent that nothing is questioned when it comes to making a buck on an acre of land. Farmers have been draining this province of its wetlands for the past 35 to 40 years with impunity. Not all farmers are stewards of the earth. In fact, we would argue most farmers do not consider the health of this planet and the health of the land that has been entrusted to them when they're making farming decisions. And this provincial government has aided and abetted this destruction of wetlands by farmers, and they're not the only provincial government in Saskatchewan that's been complicit in this. If we're waiting for the majority of farmers to take care of our wetlands, it's never going to happen because they are breaking the law, and the government says it's okay. So to the rest of the province, we're calling on the urban dwellers who are tired of spray planes flying continuously and dumping chemicals on us and our wetlands, tired of shelter belts from old yards and fence lines and tracts of forest being cleared so that farmers can make another buck on an acre of land at the expense of the health and diversity of this province. So please vote for a party that dares to stand up to farmers and Scott Moe and protect our province's most valuable resource, our wetlands. Now, most farmers are not going to take care of the wetlands because they don't like them. They want to dump them on somebody else, and in doing so, flood downstream land and destroy that farmer's land and livelihood.
All right, Sandy, I can hear
a couple more lines.
All right.
I know a couple more lines. They don't care if we lose the diversity, and this provincial government doesn't care either. And you won't find Carla Beck of the NDP singing a different tune, because we talked to her, and she said that she also would not enforce the immediate closure of illegal drainage ditches that would ultimately protect our wetlands. So, Orly, how do we get politicians and the media and the banks that loan money for this illegal ditching, citizens in general, to listen to you and your 2,000-plus petitioners?
All right, Sandy, we're going to hang it up with you. And Orly, I'll field that back to you. Also, Peter, if you'd like to weigh in after, go ahead. Orly, what do you think?
Well, you can hear in Sandy's voice her concern and her frustration. And she's just one of the many people that when we were out at the praise festivals and powwows, there was a lot of stories where there's a lot of people who are basically collateral damage. And these are people who are really proud of their land, proud of their businesses, proud to be in Saskatchewan, and they're not being heard. And often they're labeled by water security saying, and so by not having a policy, we have a system of a complaint basis, which does not build community. And if we want to grow this province, we have to have regulation and policy in place. And I mean, Sandy asked a really good question. We need leadership. We need policy. Just as Peter Levitt said, and Peter said, we need no net loss, and they want to drain even more. So it's going to be even more heartbreak for a lot of people who are just trying to have, run their businesses. So I thank Sandy for sharing that. She's right.
And Peter, over to you. Just what themes do you hear coming up here that we do need to address?
Well, she makes a very interesting point, which is that the new policy is designed to make all preceding drainage legal. That includes drainage that has been done illegally but sort of been under the cover. We've already seen the problems with this with the Quill Lakes issue, where the lakes got really high and the province looked to drain water into the National Wildlife Area in the north end of Last Mountain Lake. The water levels were high because it was snowing a fair bit and there was runoff, but also Ducks Unlimited estimates several thousand kilometers of unregulated drainage that goes downhill into the lake. So, I mean, the problem that I've got is basically one of enforcement. It's just not clear at all whether self-interest can be regulated. We'll put it that way.
Okay. All right. Well, with that, we are going to put out our email, bluesky@cbc.ca. We would love to hear from you. You're listening to Peter Levitt, who's a professor of biology, and he's also a Canada Research Chair in Environmental Change, and he's with the Institute of Environmental Change and Society. We were also hearing there from Aurelie McPherson, who was at the legislature this morning delivering 2,251 letters. Aurelie McPherson, before we let you go, what kind of a reaction did you get when you brought in all the mail?
Well, there was two reactions. One was relief on our side because these letters have been sitting on our shelves and they're very precious. So we were so happy to deliver them and so that the Premier can have a look at them. We really hope that he takes these letters with all sincerity and reads them and understands that if we want to grow this province, we need leadership, but the people's voices need to be heard.
Indeed. Well, Aurelie McPherson, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Aurelie McPherson's the chair of the Saskatchewan Alliance for Water Sustainability. And yes, she hand-delivered more than 2,200 letters to the legislature today. Letters calling for a dedicated Saskatchewan wetland policy. Not mentioning agriculture in there anyplace. We do have Aaron who is on the line. He's calling near Empress. And Aaron, welcome to Blue Sky. And I understand that you are a farmer and you've been trying to bring back some wetlands?
Well, yes, but first I would like to say thank you to Sandy for her presentation. She covered a lot of things that I would have covered. But, in our neighborhood, which I think is kind of like most neighborhoods, we see more and more wetlands or sloughs being plowed up, or more prairie in general. And it seems to be, and I can understand it, like on these dry years, a number of dry years, and most of the native sloughs are going dry, and the temptation to break it up and try to grow some crop in there is great. And I can appreciate that. I mean, I've done some in the past. I've been farming since '79, and I'm not proud of everything I've done on the farm. But at this point, we are trying to reverse that on our farm, where some of the drainage ditches that have been put in place, generations ago, we're trying to hold that water back onto our land now and create some wetlands. We've been trying to plant trees, so that's the direction we want to go. But all around me is going the opposite direction, and I don't mean to pick on the Hutterites, but they are the majority of the farmland here right now, and they seem to have a lack of understanding of what wetlands are capable of doing for them. In their view, and they'll straight out say it, they want to see nothing but crop. They won't want nothing in the way. So all the trees that have been planted here in the past are disappeared. The sloughs are being plowed up. I try to help them understand that by, they say, well, if you stay on those sloughs, you can dry them up. But if you've dried them up, you've effectively decreased your yield potential over the years because of all the reasons that have already been explained. The lack of potential to draw in rain and whatever. So anyway, that's what we're doing. But I feel kind of, pretty small potatoes, our little farm up against the corporate farms. So I don't know how we help people understand that they're actually harming their earning potential by drying up wetlands in this neighborhood. I don't know the approach.
All right,
the best thing I can do is try to lead by example.
Well, thank you for sharing your example, Aaron. I do appreciate that. And Peter Levitt, if you'd like to jump in here, is there anything that comes to mind as you hear Aaron?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of groups that are being ignored, and I think Aurelie touched on this as well. The consultations, while while better than in the past, are still targeted. That is, there's an approved group of people who get on the list, and if you're not on the list, you're not part of the consultation. And the problem is you just don't know how the inputs are being received and what inputs are absent. For example, I think the other group that is meaningfully absent in this are Indigenous peoples. They make up 17% of the overall population. Wetlands are particularly important for medicines and for exercising traditional and inherent and treaty rights. And there's just really no big consultation. And consultation with Indigenous groups is a co-development, slow process. You have to learn each other's culture, and it just takes a while. And things are going very quickly now. The plan is to have the agricultural water, stewardship policy in place this fall. And nobody is really certain how the input that they've received so far is meaningfully being used to modify the procedure, or whether it's just, window dressing.
So it's being presented as more of a fait accompli, not like here's a first draft?
Well, that's it. There is no draft. And that's something that I've written and said. It's like, with any kind of evidence-based thing, you have to have sort of the presentation and then the rebuttal. And so far, the rebuttal seems to be completely absent. Okay.
And we will be checking in with the Executive Director of Agriculture Water Management Services with Saskatchewan's Water Security Agency in a few minutes here. I think she's already listening in. We do have callers on the line. Alex, I know that you are near Iroquois Lake. Go ahead and welcome to Blue Sky. Hello there, Alex.
Hello.
Tell us,
Hi there.
What comes to mind for you when you're hearing Dr. Levitt here on the show?
Well, we've been having a struggle here at Iroquois Lake. There's a large marshy bay that comprises probably about a third of the marsh around Iroquois Lake that's been open to development for cabins. We are really dismayed at that because it seems to be one of the major spawning grounds for the fish around, wildlife, bird breeding grounds. It's been quite a battle for us for the last 2 or 3 years to try and stop that. We've also had First Nations involved that opposed it to no avail. But the problem with our democratic system seems that once elected officials are in, they can act in an autocratic manner and do not have to listen to consultation of the public or even, people that are actually in direct neighborhoods of aquatic habitat destructions. Rebecca Ebert from the Department of Environment, she's a fishery biologist, wrote a report to the Water Security Agency about Iroquois Lake. It was ignored. So we're not very confident in the democratic process in this province anymore, especially when it comes to a rural municipality or a provincial government. The other thing I want to mention is in terms of irrigation. Why is irrigation not being enforced in terms of trickle irrigation? Why is pivot irrigation still being promoted? I do not understand that. There are, albeit more expensive, but much more water-saving methods to irrigate crops than pivot irrigation. So having said that, I want to see what Dr. Levitt has to say from it.
All right, over to you, Peter. Thank you so much for the call, Alex. And again, if you have thoughts, go ahead and send us an email, bluesky@cbc.ca. Just reaction to what Alex is saying about his situation, not feeling like his voice is heard.
I am familiar with this. I was asked to comment on it by another group, and I sort of have been writing behind the scenes on it. The upshot is it raises an interesting point that wetlands are not just standalone things in the middle of somebody's fields. There's fringing wetlands that are around most major water bodies, and as Alex points out, they're very, very important for reproduction of aquatic species. The challenge, or the thing that I find disheartening is that there's probably, well, I know there are about 1,000 requests for shoreline management or shoreline modification received by Water Security Agency in a given year. Very, very few of them are denied, suggesting that there's really nothing you can do to the side of a lake that's sufficiently damaging that it would be denied. And this is kind of the grow the economy, go forward model without thinking about developing the economy. In other words, bigger isn't better, bigger is just bigger, and sometimes bigger is more damaging.
Okay, and before I let you go, Dr. Levitt, if you had one piece of advice or one thing you would write into the new Agricultural Water Stewardship Policy, what would it be?
Honestly, listen to the people. I think that I've actually been a little bit surprised that there's been not too much pushback on anything that's been said. I understand that there's some farmers who'd be very upset by the idea that we need to reestablish wetlands, but you need to look at it at sort of the whole landscape perspective. You can't manage the water because water flows everywhere. You can't manage the water on a farm by farm basis, which is kind of where we're going with this. You need to think about how it moves across the landscape and listening to all the people in the landscape and trying to accommodate their desires as well as the requirements to protect the environment. I think those are the two pieces.
All right. Dr. Levitt, thank you so much for joining us today on Blue Sky.
You're very welcome anytime.
Peter Levitt's a professor at the University of Regina. He is a biologist, a Canada Research Chair in Environmental Change, and he's a co-director of the Society for Environmental Change and Society. If you have thoughts on what you're hearing on the show, we would love to hear from you. bluesky@cbc.ca. If you happen to be on one of our lines waiting for your chance to talk, I'm going to give you a shortcut. Call Talkback at 1-800-661-7540. It's going to be a little automated menu. Follow the prompts to get to Blue Sky and leave us a message. You've got about 2 minutes in there. 1-800-661-7540. Please follow the prompts to get yourself to Blue Sky. And again, that email, bluesky@cbc.ca. I'm Jennifer Cannell, sitting in for Garth Materi, and we're at 16 minutes now before 1 o'clock. Our next guest is the Executive Director of Agriculture Water Management Services. This is with Saskatchewan's Water Security Agency. Leah Clark has run hundreds of hours of consultations with people and with groups who are concerned about water policy, and she joins us on the line. Good afternoon, Leah.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So we've heard from a number of folks today on the show who one of the primary concerns is, why is wetland management being put under the umbrella of agricultural water management? Why do it this way?
Yeah, I think that, wetlands that we are looking at are in the egg zones of the provinces. And so that being said, it's important that we include kind of both of those pieces together. But with that, our diverse consultation is bringing in all perspectives or attempting to bring in all perspectives. And I realize there's some criticism to that. So I just kind of want to outline, who we're engaging with. And we're engaging with everyone. With that dedicated website, I heard it was scary, but we have all the consultation materials on the website for everyone to be able to access, as well as a dedicated email. We also are engaging when people are requesting. We're doing one-on-ones. But on top of that, we do have a list of 70 stakeholders that we've been reaching out to. Another criticism I heard earlier was not including in the Indigenous voice. And we heard that early on, and we tried to rectify that. And so we brought in and also undertook dedicated Indigenous engagement. And we got 28 independent First Nation and Métis locals represented at a July plenary, and we continue consultations with them as well.
One of the things that can make water management in Saskatchewan really complicated is that you do have landowners, you do have farmers who want to get as many available acres out as they can. I know that the provincial auditor has suggested it up to 5 years ago, was saying, there's a lot of illegal stuff happening. The WSA is not, the enforcement side is lacking. What's happened since then in terms of just making sure when people do try to dig a ditch across their land and drain the water out that it's being done by the book?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. So the first thing I want to just address is, and it was a comment made earlier, is that on the table right now is that we're looking to allow proceeding drainage and make it approved. And that's not true. what we're doing at the Water Security Agency is we took that feedback, we heard it loud and clear, and we did a reorganization of our unit here in Agricultural Water Management. And that reorganization, we have a dedicated compliance group that's on the ground doing drainage compliance. But the other piece that we've incorporated is looking at compliance is kind of an awareness and education, preventative, and then that compliance, stopping it and ordering it. And what we're finding is a large percentage of the producers and drainers out there will voluntarily comply and work with us and work with downstream landowners to mitigate those effects.
Do you ever ask them to fill back in a ditch that was illegal?
Absolutely. We're constantly, our compliance unit is constantly working with landowners to fill ditches and advise them on how to properly do that to retain water.
And how many people are in the compliance unit out on the ground looking for illegal stuff?
So we have with Ag Water Management, there's 36 FTEs that we have dedicated to
full-time equivalents. Yep. Okay.
And I just wanted to kind of dive into, as part of that compliance, I talked about education, awareness, prevention. Prevention is a huge piece to this. And a big component of our prevention is the approvals process. So all drainage across all of the province requires an approval. And this isn't easy to get. Lots of times we get people that want to do drainage to bring in engineers, technologists to help them design a project. And with each project, we look at it in terms of water quality, quantity, habitat, and soil health effects. And we implement different controls, mitigative controls on these drainage projects to make sure that we're mitigating the downstream effects.
Okay, and Leah, that sounds really good, but we are getting emails from like a guy named Jim just sent us an email to bluesky@cbc.ca, and he says, the WSA says, yeah, by all law, drainage requires a license, but illegal wetland drainage continues unregulated and unenforced, even in the Quill Lakes area where he is, even when it's reported to the WSA. And he says, I mean, this is, if you look back over time, it's consumed 90,000 acres of farmland in his area. What do you tell a guy named like Jim?
Yeah. Call in. We have our dedicated compliance officers. We are actively looking at drainage. I mean, we're busy. We're a busy unit, and so we are working on it.
Now, I know that in other provinces, for example, Manitoba, if you do ask for a permit to drain some land and you're losing some of the wetland on that acreage, they have a net loss policy where, okay, you drain one, you got to restore another. Do we have that here?
Yeah, so what we do is we've recognized that Saskatchewan is a very diverse province. And so the example I'm going to use is the Southwest compared to the Southeast, right? Southwest, we don't see a lot of drainage. Southeast, we do. And so with that, it's just we have different parameters and different requirements depending on where people are draining, and that includes species at risk, and we take all of those factors into account. So there's some areas of the province where, yes, we have to consolidate or have that same policy that Manitoba has. There's some areas that we don't. So we really look at it from a regional perspective. And in fact, our current engagement, that's the thing that we hear loud and clear, is that we don't want a blanket approach. We want a flexible approach to take into account the variety of landscapes we have in Saskatchewan.
And I have another point for you raised by another listener. Murray sent an email to bluesky@cbc.ca saying, since 2018, provincial auditors have been saying, enforce these policies, but the current complaint system is pitting neighbor against neighbor. Complaints allowed to drag on for 5 years or more, no resolutions. Why can't we just file these complaints with a conservation officer, for instance? They could do an investigation and decide where to lay charges.
Yeah, that's a great question too. So conservation officers are part of our process, if and when needed. That's why I hesitated when you asked how many FTEs, right? Because we do pull in other supports when needed. And that being said, we do have a request for assistance process, but when drainage occurs on the landscape, we really do need it to be a network approach, and that's what we strive for here in Saskatchewan. So working with neighbors towards a project that works, or if it doesn't, then it's not approved to go forward.
Well, how can you tell whether the way you've got it laid out right now is working or not?
Yeah, so an example of this is when a project comes forward for approval, we look at it, we get it designed, look at all of the mitigation requirements that are needed. But the other really important part is that everyone in that drainage network and where that water goes downstream also has to agree to the plan. And if they don't agree to the plan, it isn't an approved project. So it really does, our process does build in that whole kind of network approach and collaborative approach.
Now, I know with the new policy that's being developed this fall, one of the biggest concerns that Dr. Peter Levitt was raising is the question around what's the proportion of existing wetlands that we can still safely drain. His answer is none. Start putting some back. What is sort of the underlying modus operandi for this policy as it goes forward? Is it more, okay, let's get more farmland out safely, or is it let's restore wetlands?
I think that's exactly why engagement is such an important part of this process, because we don't have those answers. So we need a diverse perspective at the table helping us. And that's where we're at right now, is we're collecting that input. And I did note that there was kind of a criticism that don't have that developed yet. And we do have a plenary and engagement session actually this Thursday happening, where those 70 stakeholder groups are invited to come, and we are going to be looking at and discussing some policy options. But I just do not have the answer to that question, and that's why we have to engage.
Well, I guess I'm wondering, at what point do you send out scientists to actually measure, okay, here's how much we have in terms of wetlands, here's the water quality sitting inside them. Where do scientists intersect with this new policy?
I think they're a really important part. In fact, WSA has a number of scientists employed doing that on the ground every day, as well as collaborative relationships we have with scientists. So we're trying to leverage that all and come up with science that works. And you know, we talked about wetland loss. Peter mentioned it, but we have taken up-to-date research and looked at wetland loss, and our numbers are showing that we have 86% of wetlands retained in Saskatchewan.
Right, because that's counting areas that do get seeded and farmed.
Yeah, absolutely. But the hydrologic function is still maintained.
And I think we can agree to disagree on, okay, should those be included or not? And one of the concerns that's come up, this is actually from Tim, who emailed us from Reed Link, which is close to the Duncairn Dam. And he says he's just concerned with proposed irrigation expansion. He says that the engagement sessions that he was notified about, it's cabin owners especially who are concerned about fish spawning, the migratory bird sanctuary there. He says adequate study has not been conducted by independent qualified scientists in these fields. What can you assure him when it comes in terms of assessing fish spawn and migratory birds when you're deciding how much water we can devote to irrigation for farmland?
Right. So I can't speak to the engagement piece there, but I can assure you that we have scientists and collaborations always working together to look at the whole picture when we're proposing these sorts of things. But that being said, we do have offices around the province and people that he can talk to help him with his specific concerns.
Quick question about the thousands of letters delivered to the legislature today from people concerned about the new policy. Where do they fit in terms of all the consultations you've been trying to run, Leah?
Yeah, I think this is an important part, right? People having their say and being involved in this engagement. And I think this is one piece. I think we do appreciate the sensitivity and emotions attached to wetlands, and it demonstrates that we're doing important work, and we will take those and look at them and see how we can incorporate it.
And if somebody watches when the final draft of this policy comes out, I don't know, how long do you have to actually get a final draft out the door?
Yeah, so I mean, we're really committed to getting this right. And so we have talked about a fall timeline for a policy release. Now, that being said, we are just looking at policy options with our stakeholders here later this week. And so we really do want to focus on a good product. And of course, we'll try to keep to timelines, but we still need to get in all those important perspectives.
Absolutely. So fall, maybe, in terms of when the final draft comes out. And Leah, is there anything else you wanted to tell our listeners just before we go?
Just, I think Saskatchewan is a place that we should all be proud of. And I know that, there's an intersect where farmland and water bodies intersect. And it's an important intersection. But it's also important to note that in Saskatchewan, we have 44% of Canada's annual crops. And we really do need to find that balance between food security and water security. And
Leah.
So feedback will help us find that balance.
Indeed. Leah, thank you.
Thank you.
Leah Clark's the Executive Director of Agriculture Water Management Services with the Water Security Agency. And if you wanted to get your call on, call Talkback. Send us a little message at 1-800-661-7540. Pick the option for Blue Sky. Our email, bluesky@cbc.ca.